You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 124. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. What comes to mind for you when you think about networking? I have worked with a number of lawyers and law students who have very different views about what networking entails. For some of you, it's something that you get excited about, you look forward to, you look for as many opportunities as you can to get out there and meet people. And for others of you, you might associate networking with business cards, awkward conversations, and even that experience of the cold, clammy handshake. You know, when you shake hands with somebody who's been holding a drink in their hand and it's cold and, it's just awkward. And so there's a whole spectrum in terms of how you feel about networking. And the object of today's podcast is to give you some tips and tricks when it comes to networking so that you can navigate your next networking events with greater confidence and ease. Now, networking is a topic that is relevant at all stages of your legal career. If you're a law student listening to this podcast episode, when it comes out, it's September 2023, and we're in recruitment season. In North America, this is the time of year where law firms are recruiting from the law schools for placements within their firms. And so networking might be top of mind for you in terms of how to prepare for interviews, cocktail parties, career fairs, receptions. And so I would invite you to think about how the tips that we're talking about today would apply to you. Now, I had the privilege of being invited to speak at Allard Law, which is the law school here in Vancouver, the other week. And I presented on networking and we conducted an in-person speed networking exercise. And it was so great. It was such a great experience. It was so wonderful to be able to practice and learn in the moment and to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities around networking. So I will be sharing some of the discussion points that we discussed in this podcast episode today. Now, the other thing I'd like to mention about networking is that it's relevant no matter what stage you're at. So if you're a student, of course, this is the time of year where you would be thinking about networking for the job seeking or the job hiring process. If you're further on in your career, then networking is relevant for a number of different reasons. It's relevant to expand your professional network so that you can have friends, so you can have mentors, people with interests in common. It is relevant if you're in a job search. So let's say you've decided that you want to transition. It helps if you can network and learn about what kind of opportunities are out there for you. If you're looking to expand your practice, maybe you're looking to expand into a new practice area or attract new clients or raise your profile within the legal profession. There's all of these ways in which networking can create opportunities for you, both personally and professionally. So I would invite you, regardless of the stage that you're at, to think about how networking is relevant in your practice and how what we're talking about here today applies to you. So I have got 7 tips altogether. They are in a do and don't format. So you might think about those magazine articles where they're like, here's what you should wear and here's what you should not wear. It's kind of that same concept. You may or may not agree with the way that I have set these out, and that is fine. The exercise here is for you to think about what resonates for you. So by all means, if you disagree with me, no problem. Think about what would resonate with you. So with that, we're going to jump in with tip number 1, which is to create a plan. Before you go to a networking event, I would invite you to have a plan for yourself. I invite you to set small, achievable goals. Now, networking events might be as intimate as a one-to-one conversation, an informational interview, a coffee date, a lunch date with a single person where you're looking to learn more about that person and their practice and any opportunities that they might know about that would be relevant to you. And the networking event might be as large as thousands of lawyers in a ballroom who are there for a career fair or an industry event. So there's a broad range. And the goals that you'll have for those events will be different depending on the event itself. So you might think about that one-to-one conversation. Maybe there's specific information that you're looking for. Maybe there's a particular impression that you want to make. That might be the goal that you have. You might plan out some questions that you want to ask. If you're at a larger event, your goal might be to meet a certain number of people. You might come prepared with some questions that you can rely on in case you have trouble coming up with questions in the moment. So you just want to have a plan so that when you go into that event, you have an idea of what it is that you're looking to do. Now, when I presented at the university, one of the students raised a question around this, and I love the question. He said something to the effect of, what if having a plan, having a goal feels uncomfortable? What if it feels unnatural? And if that resonates with you, then I completely understand. And I would invite you to still have a goal for the networking event. The reason that I would invite you to have the goal is because let's say you step into that ballroom and there's thousands of people and it feels completely overwhelming and you don't know where to begin. If you've set a goal for yourself of meeting 5 individuals, then you can get started on that goal. You can find somebody and meet person number 1 and then meet person number 2. And by the time you get to person number 3, chances are you've already felt a little bit more comfortable. You're getting into the groove and maybe you no longer need that plan. So I would invite you to think about having that plan, maybe some questions that you want to ask, some goals that you want to walk away with at the end of the event. That is the do. Now, the don't here is don't feel confined by the plan. Don't feel like you have to stick to the script. If you've got a list of questions of things that you'd like to ask in an informational interview and you don't get a chance to ask all those questions, that is no problem. Again, the purpose of setting out questions in advance isn't necessarily that you're going to ask every single question. It's that you're putting your mind to the fact that you're having a meeting with another person and you want to come prepared so that you can carry your end of the conversation seamlessly. So that is the don't here, is don't feel like you have to stick to the plan. If you're at that conference and you're on person number 4 and you're having the conversation of your life or the conference is about to end, you don't have to go and meet person number 5 just to check that box. The fact that you had that goal for yourself was what it took to get over that initial threshold. So tip number 2, the do, is do let it be awkward. One of the things that many people find off-putting about networking is that it can feel really awkward. I've been on both sides of the table, both on the side of the law firm, for example, or the employer that is looking to hire at a job fair, and the student who's there looking to ask questions and learn more about organizations. And what I can tell you is that when you are the person who's acting as a representative, it feels awkward sometimes, especially if you're looking for people to talk to. If you want people to come talk to you, you're there, you have information to share. They may feel as awkward as you do. If you're the student and you think, well, that person, they look so accomplished. They're so much more senior to me. They've been practicing for years. They can't possibly want to strike up a conversation with me. I assure you they do. So I would invite you to embrace awkwardness as a part of the process. Chances are, if you're at a networking event, things are going to happen that are awkward. You're going to join a conversation. There might be a circle of people talking and you go up and you join them and nobody acknowledges that you're there and you're standing there for several minutes and you wonder, should I stay here? Should I go? This feels a bit awkward. Maybe you're in conversation with somebody and you say the absolute wrong thing and you feel really embarrassed and you feel like you stuck your foot in your mouth and you just want to crawl underground. I mean, these things happen. And so tip number 2 is to embrace the awkwardness. Now, the don't here for the letting it be awkward is don't let awkwardness hold you back. Don't let awkwardness be a reason that you do not attend an event in the first place, and do not let awkwardness be the reason that you do not initiate a conversation. Tip number 3 is to ask questions. Probably one of the easiest ways of being an effective conversationalist is to ask questions of other people. People love answering questions, especially when those questions allow them to talk about themselves, talk about their work, talk about things that they are passionate about. So I would invite you to think about questions that you can ask, whether it's in a large environment, this cocktail party reception type situation, or in a one-to-one informational interview type setting. Now, when it comes to asking questions, there is a difference in quality of questions. I'd invite you to ask open-ended questions, which of course are questions that cannot be answered by yes or no. An open-ended question would be, what did you think of the movie? A closed-ended question would be, did you like the movie? And so you can see how one question invites a more complete response. It requires that person to really think about it. What did I like about that movie? Versus the other question, which can have the effect of shutting down the conversation. No, I didn't like the movie, right? So, although I suppose you could ask, well, what didn't you like about the movie? You might think about asking a series of questions. So for some people, they will ask 3 questions just to go deeper in terms of what that other person is saying. Again, what you're trying to do here is establish that connection, learn more about that person. Now, it's really important when you're asking questions that you listen to the person when they answer your question. Chances are, if you're like most of us, you've had the experience of being in conversation with somebody where they ask you a question and then you go to answer the question and they aren't looking at you. Their eyes are looking over you. They're looking beside you. It's as though they're scanning the room for somebody who's more interesting than you or more important than you. And it can be really off-putting. So you want to focus on the person and listen attentively. And there's a podcast episode that I recorded a few weeks ago about active listening. It's one of the skills that I learned and developed as a coach. And so you can learn some tips and tricks when it comes to active listening that are really helpful in these types of social situations. Now, the don't here is, let's say you are asking a lot of questions. I would encourage you to not ask so many questions that you're not sharing anything about yourself. Now, an example that comes to mind for me here is a student that I worked with a few years ago who was going through the interview process at law firms and was having some challenges because the way she was approaching the interviews was trying to keep her options open. She actually had a very discrete interest in a narrow practice area of law, and she had a very compelling personal story for why that practice area resonated with her, but she didn't share that story because she didn't want to pigeonhole herself and risk the chance that the firm that she was speaking with, or the firms that she was speaking with, didn't have open positions in that particular practice area. Now, what ended up happening for her is she changed her strategy in the interviews. She actually volunteered that this was a practice area that she was really interested in, and she had a very compelling story behind it. And she ended up finding a job at a firm that offered exactly the practice area that she wanted to have. So the lesson here is, yes, we want to ask questions. We want to be able to carry the conversation and to listen to somebody, get to know them. And we also want to be able to share about ourselves so that in those interactions, people now know about you. So for example, if you're a student interested in litigation and you're letting somebody at a law firm know that this is something you're interested in, they now know that if they're looking to hire litigation students, they can reach out to you. If you're further along in your career, let's say that you are many years into practice and you're looking to expand your family law practice into collaborative dispute resolution, and you're speaking with somebody who happens to know somebody who has a person who's looking for a lawyer who is in that type of work, who is into the more collaborative approach to separation, then they might be able to put you in contact with that person. So you want to be specific enough about what it is that you have to offer so that when opportunities come up, the person that you're speaking with can then match you with that particular opportunity. So just to recap, we talked about number 1 was to plan, but not be too stuck to your plan. Tip number 2 was to let it be awkward and not let awkwardness stop you from taking initiative or attending networking opportunities. Number 3 is to ask questions, but not to the exclusion of sharing information about yourself. Number 4 is to find mutual interests. So what you want to do when you're speaking with somebody at one of these networking events, if you're going in for an informational interview, is to find common ground. Maybe you went to the same law school. Maybe you vacationed in the same lake. Maybe you went to the same summer camp. Maybe you know people in common. So there's all these ways that you may have something in common. It might be the practice area that you're interested in. So find out what you have in common with that person, and that can form a basis of your conversation. Now, the caution here is that I would invite you to not go too far too fast. So what you might find is if you meet somebody and you have so much in common and you feel like you know them really well, I would caution you against offering too much information, right? Especially if it's in a professional context. Let's say it's a job interview or part of a job interview process, or if it's something that is where it's more of a professional capacity versus a personal capacity, you may want to hold off on sharing more about your personal life until you know that person better. It's not that you don't want to do it at all. It's just that too much too soon can sometimes backfire. So you'll want to pay attention to that. Now, the next suggestion, the next do, is to make connections. So here, what I'd invite you to think about, and this becomes more relevant as you gain seniority in your profession, is that as you network, as you meet new people, you'll start to think about people that the person that you're meeting would very likely like to meet, right? That there's something, if you're speaking with person A, person B, who's also in your network, you see them as having a mutual interest and you want to put them in contact with each other. This is something that I really value. I really appreciate it when people put me in contact with other people that they think would have something in common with me, that we have mutual interests, that we could support each other professionally. And so I would invite you to think about how you can help the people that you're speaking with by making introductions to others. So that is the do. Now, the don't here is please don't introduce people without giving people an opportunity to consent to the introduction. And here's what I mean by that. Sometimes when you want to introduce people, you'll want to do it in a way that perhaps is efficient. So maybe you want to send an email where you're introducing two people and saying, hey, you should talk to each other. You have a lot in common. You'd probably really hit it off. Now, it's not wrong to do that, and it's clearly well-intentioned. However, it can put somebody in an awkward position if they are introduced without that initial request for their permission. So what I like to do is if I'm going to introduce somebody to somebody, I would reach out to the person that I want to introduce someone to and ask them if it's okay. So for example, at the university the other week, I met a student who is here from overseas who's interested in a particular practice area. Now, I happen to know a lawyer who is from the same country that she is from, who is practicing in that same practice area. And so I said to the student, there's somebody who I think you would really benefit from meeting. Let me circle back to them and see if they're open to me making a connection. And then I went and asked that person if it was okay. I think this is probably the best practice. Sometimes if you're referring clients, then maybe it's not quite as necessary. So if, for example, someone comes to you and they're looking for a litigator for a commercial dispute, and you happen to know that, there's these 3 firms that are really excellent at commercial disputes, and so you give somebody their names, you may not need to reach out to the lawyers at those firms and say, hey, I gave so-and-so your name so you might hear from them. By all means, you can do that. And that probably is the best practice. But in some cases, it's not quite as necessary to make that introduction or to ask for that permission. But it's always nice if you do that. Hey, I was thinking of referring you a new client. Do you have capacity to take them on? That is probably the preferable way to do it. What has happened to me sometimes is that somebody very well-meaning will make an introduction. And for example, somebody reached out to me recently and they emailed me and copied somebody else and said, hey, and this is not somebody that I know particularly well. And they said, hey, I was speaking with Claire, I don't know her name, and I think she'd be a great guest for your podcast. And I had never met Claire. I didn't know anything about Claire. And now I was kind of looped into this conversation with somebody that I didn't know. And so it put me in a little bit of an awkward position because I hadn't really been given an opportunity to say yes or to say no. So here, the do, of course, is to make connections using people who you know in your network. If you think that there are mutual benefits to people getting to know each other, then facilitating those interactions is a wonderful thing. However, I would encourage you, so the don't here is to think about how you approach that. And best practice here is to seek the permission of the people that you're introducing to make that introduction. Now, number 6 is to treat everybody equally. When you are in these interactions, whether it's a networking event at a big ballroom, for example, and maybe there's the serving staff and there's lawyers and there's other people who are putting on the event, you want to be as kind to the person who brings you a glass of wine as you are to the person that you're speaking with. If you're a law student, for example, and you're circulating through a law firm and meeting everybody, you want to be kind to the person at reception, the articling students, the summer students, whoever it is that you happen to be meeting. You want to be as gracious with them as you are with the managing partner. So my invitation to you is to treat everybody equally, to treat everybody respectfully, and to make sure that you're consistent with that. The don't here is when you're interacting, for example, with people who maybe you know on a more informal basis. So maybe it's an interview and you know somebody who's already at the organization. It might be you're a student and there are other students who work at a particular firm. And so you have that more casual interaction with them. Or maybe you're more senior and you have a friend or a colleague who works at the organization that you're applying to. I would invite you to not be overly familiar in conversations that you have with that person. So I think sometimes we might overshare in that situation inadvertently, and it may affect your possibilities or your chances of being brought into the organization if something that you say, for example, maybe doesn't align or it's taken the wrong way. So that is the tip then, is to treat everybody equally. And the don't here is don't engage in conversations that are overly familiar, particularly if what you're seeking is an opportunity, a professional opportunity like a job. Now, the 7th tip here is to practice. So when you're out there, make opportunities for yourself to practice networking. This might mean striking up a conversation with your local barista. This might mean putting yourself out there in situations that you wouldn't normally go to. It might be attending in-person events. It might be attending virtual events. If you're attending virtual events, conferences, for example, I love raising my hand or asking questions or using the chat, showing people that you're there and that you're engaged. If you're in person and you've been to a seminar, you might go and speak with the presenter and introduce yourself. Again, going back to that plan, have an idea of what it is that you're looking to achieve in a particular event. Do you want to meet somebody? Do you want to learn about something in particular? So give yourself those goals and then follow through on those. And the more you practice, the more natural this is going to feel. And if there was some awkwardness initially, that awkwardness will fall away over time. Now, the don't here when it comes to practicing is don't be too hard on yourself. You may stick your foot in your mouth. You may do it all wrong. You may go to an event and feel like you completely blew it. And if that's what happened, then that is totally fine, totally normal, and part of the process. And so please, whatever you do not beat yourself up over it. Awkwardness, as I mentioned at point 2, is part of the game. And so you can allow for that and give yourself that grace. Now, I mentioned that there would be a bonus. There's the 7 tips and the bonus. And just to recap those tips then is number 1, to plan. That's the do, but don't be too stuck to the plan. Number 2 is to let it be awkward and don't let that awkwardness hold you back from engaging in networking opportunities. Number 3 is to ask questions, but don't ask so many questions that you're not sharing about yourself. Number 4 is to find mutual interests, but steer away from oversharing too much too soon. Number 5 is to make connections with those that you meet with others in your network. The don't here is more of a do, actually, is do seek permission from people and give them that opportunity to say yes. It just makes for a smoother introduction overall. Number 6 is to treat everybody equally. So whether it's the person at reception or the person bringing you your glass of wine, or if it's the senior managing partner, you want to make sure that everybody that you speak with is receiving the same you, right? This gracious, polite, and engaged person that you are. Number 7 is to practice. So the do is to practice, and the don't here is to don't beat yourself up. And sorry, I forgot the don't attached to tip number 6. Treat everybody equally. And the don't that is attached to number 6 is don't, again, it's almost like that oversharing. Don't enter into conversations that are too personal, depending on the context that you are in. Now, the bonus question here is one that was posed during the in-person networking opportunity. And it was how to excuse yourself when you're in a conversation with somebody and they're talking and it's very difficult to remove yourself from the conversation. So this can look a number of different ways. You might be the only person in that conversation. It may be a one-to-one conversation, or it might be a group conversation where you're one of many, you're all in a circle, and somehow you want to manage to excuse yourself because you want to move on to a different conversation. So what I recommend doing in this particular situation is first, I would invite you to think about how the conversation that you're in aligns with the goal that you have for the event. So for example, if you're at a networking event where the goal is to be hired into a particular position, and the person that you're speaking with is in a position to make decisions about that, then you'll probably want to spend more time with that person relatively, for example, to a situation where you're in a conversation with somebody. Again, you're there because you're looking to secure a job, and the person may simply not be related to that decision-making process. Now, it sounds a little bit calculated, and in a sense it is. And I think the question to ask yourself here is, does it make sense for me to be in this conversation? And going back to the idea of treating everybody equally, you never want to come across as unfriendly or unkind or ungracious. But at the same time, if you've gone to an event for a specific purpose, then you do need to free yourself up to speak with people that align with that purpose. So number one is to think about who it is that you're speaking with. Another question you might ask yourself is, does this person, are they engaged with me as well? And what you might find is sometimes you have conversations with individuals who are there and they're speaking, but they're not really paying all that much attention to the person that they are speaking with. It's almost like they've got a laundry list of stories and they're telling the stories, and it doesn't really matter who is there. So you might ask yourself, what value are they placing on this particular conversation? And if you feel like this is a conversation where, they're not that interested in you, they're really more interested in just talking about themselves, then again, I think it's okay to excuse yourself from the conversation and move to a different conversation. If you're in a group, it may be a little bit easier to excuse yourself if there's a number of people there. Again, you might just want to make a subtle exit from the conversation. So things that you might be able to say, you might want to say something like, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. I see my colleague over there and I meant to catch up with them at this particular event. I'll look forward to speaking with you again soon. So you want to say something to end the conversation or to wrap up the conversation and move on in a way that is polite and allows you to move forward. What you don't want to do, I was trying to think of some don'ts for this particular example, is to give an excuse that you won't be able to adhere to. So for example, if you were to end the conversation with that person because you told them, well, my cat needs to be let out or my dog needs to be let out, so I've got to be home in 15 minutes. And then that person sees you and you're still at the event 2 hours later, then that's a little bit disingenuous. So probably not the kind of excuse that you would want to use to remove yourself from that conversation. So those are the tips that I have to share with you today when it comes to networking. So for all of you, thank you for joining me here today. I wish you all the best in your next networking opportunity. If you are interested in working together to talk about networking, talk about job transitions, by all means, please do feel free to reach out to me. And if you're looking to expand your network, I'd also invite you to consider making inquiries and joining my next group of mastermind women lawyers. I'll be starting another group in January 2024. The program is a 6-month program where I have 8 women lawyers who assemble. We get together twice a month. We have topics for each of the months, and it's a wonderful way to meet with other lawyers to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that we're having. And so that might be a great opportunity for you, not only to advance in your practice, but also to foster relationships with other professionals. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you again for joining me here this week. It has been a pleasure. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.